Last time we spent the day on Lake Havasu and paddled up and down the Colorado River. After the day was over, we went south to the Salton Sea in a place known as Slab City. It's a little place, used to be a army base during World War II, and they leveled it shortly after and just left it there, abandoned. The state of California took it over, and shortly after that, lots of people moved in and started squatting on the property, and ever since then it has been known as Slab City. When I first rolled in, I wanted to park outside the city proper and get the feel and the vibe before I did any exploring. I was there to explore the Salton Sea, but I wanted to check out the last free place in America also. Next morning I got up and did some exploring. This is Salvation Mountain, probably one of the best known places in Slab City, and it's probably internationally known. The guy that built this place died recently, but he had been working on Salvation Mountain for 30 years. It's built out of bales of hay and cob covered in mud, and donated paint. I think it was 30,000 gallons of paint that was donated. It's pretty spectacular, the artistic endeavor, which, as you will see in Slab City, there is a lot of extraordinary art, much of it very childlike, but interesting nonetheless. And a few of the places in here you can see exposed bales of hay, but most of it's pretty well done. I'm thinking that this is one of those things that takes decades to finish. As I walked outside Salvation Mountain, I started to explore some of the living quarters that surround it. And my assumption is that these people are the caretakers currently of Salvation Mountain. Had a couple of brief conversations, but a lot of the people around here don't really like to talk to tourists, so I kept my distance. But lots of interesting art installations on the vehicles, the campers, and you can see it's still a work in progress. Didn't see anybody building or painting, but it's obvious that there's still some construction and painting going on. I really dig art cars and folk art, as I would describe most of the stuff that you see out here. The untrained artist, people that just feel like expressing themselves, like finger painting. That's basically what you see out here a lot. Although I see the art in all this, or at least most of it. Some of it's quite fascinating. Salvation Mountain is just one of the installations. East Jesus, as we'll get to later on, is another, and it's quite extraordinary also. And as you move in, you start seeing a lot of the squalor that's a bit shocking and off-putting, and honestly a bit scary. You know, I'm a pretty big guy. I'm a tough guy, but you know, when you roll into places like this where you see people that obviously don't give a crap about their surroundings, to the point of not cleaning, you know, at least straightening up. There's no grass to mow out here, and I don't really have high standards, but when you see just trash everywhere like this, it's a bit off-putting. but there's the good and the bad, and this is probably as bad as it gets. But the place is covered up with people this time of year. There's only a couple of hundred people living here year-round, but in the winter months, when it cools off, becomes very comfortable. You see all types. You see people from up north coming down for the winter, the snowbirds from Canada. You see all types. You see people like these folks, just like me, tourists, that are probably camping in $250,000, $500,000 RVs. They tend to keep to themselves in smaller groups. They circle the wagons and they find their spot. And then you see the diversity of, you know, kids just escaping, living in tents, living in smaller RVs, vans, cars. There's all kinds. And then there's the people that live here year-round that resent the other people that come in the cooler months. That's a hardcore group. People that can live out here in the desert, 120 degrees. That's pretty hardcore as far as I'm concerned. But like I said, all types out here. There was probably 1,500, 2,000 people out here when I was out, and it was definitely worth the trip. I would highly recommend it with some caveats, and I'll make sure I cover those before the end of the video. But I highly recommend it just because the visual, even if it's a day trip, you know, you don't plan on camping out here, even if it's a day trip, I think that might be the best bet. That people that want to see the place but are a bit uncomfortable like me. But as you can see, lots of places had quality neighborhoods, and this one's clearly a quality neighborhood because of the official stamp. But this was probably one of the nicer houses, I guess you would call it, and they had more than a couple of schoolies. And although it's a decommissioned army base, there's still a firing range just beyond in the distance. You see these military helicopters flying over. The mountain in the background is called Chocolate Mountain, and they use that as a firing range. And I did see some night fire going on. It's pretty cool seeing the tracers in the distance hitting the mountains. I didn't get good footage of it, but it was still kind of cool to see the military flying over, and gave a little interesting twist to the whole 3 days that I was there. Day 2, I finally felt comfortable enough to pull the motorcycle out and leave the bus unattended for a few hours and do some real exploring. Right here I'm looking down on Slab City from Salvation Mountain, and you can see a little bit more dimension of the scale of this place. It kind of seems like it goes on forever. The people are centrally located despite all that, but back in the distance is Chocolate Mountain, and I went towards the Salton Sea this day and did some exploring around the Salton Sea and found this mud pit with some geothermal activity going on, and just in the background you can see a geothermal plant that's actually, I'm guessing, drilled some shafts down into the earth to harness some of the heat coming off of this pocket of desert where it's producing. And you can see lots of holes in the ground where this hot water is bubbling up and receding, and then quite a few of these little mud cones. I'd call them cinder cones, but they have no cinder. It's just mud. It's boiling mud, and as you can see, it's quite hot. You can see the power plant back in the distance. And another interesting thing, there's a geothermal power plant and a solar power plant within probably 2 miles of each other. But this is a bit of a moonscape here, a very odd thing to see in the middle of the desert. And I spent a little bit of time walking around the mud pits and getting some of the sights and the sounds. I would call the Salton Sea a beautiful place, but it's hard for me to see the real beauty here. What's really shocking is the immense amount of salt in this sea, and yet seeing the wildlife that still exists here. Apparently this is a bird sanctuary. Maybe something having to do with migration of birds, but there was quite a large number of birds out here, given the fact that this is not fresh water. Well, it's fresh water that's contaminated with salt from the runoff from all the farming in the area. That's what made the Salton Sea collapse. It's an artificial lake formed by accident years ago and turned into a resort in the 50s. But the runoff from all the farming made the lake so salty that the real estate market soon collapsed. And out here you see some kind of a bird blind. I'm not really sure what this is, but maybe people are studying bird migration, or I don't know, maybe even hunting. I would be surprised. But continuing on around the edge of the Salton Sea, I ran into another volcanic mud pit a good ways away from where I was earlier, and this seemed a little bit more active and even spookier. Big huge boiling vats of mud and steam, and pretty surprising to see this much hydrothermal geothermal activity in a mud pit right next to the Salton Sea. I had no idea. But it's not just this. Closer to Chocolate Mountain, there's all kinds of resorts that offer hot springs, and I'm guessing that you might be even able to bathe in a hot pit like this, although I never would get anywhere close to this. This stuff had to be 150 degrees. Scalding hot, take your skin off. So I'm not sure what the other hot springs offer in the area, but this is very reminds me of Yellowstone a good bit. That's what you see a lot around Yellowstone, is bubbling mud and vents like this, but nothing that looks like Earth. This looks like, you know, some other world. And that's the impression I got. But I spent a few more minutes here before I kept riding around the sea just to find out what else was out here. As I kept riding north around the rim of the Salton Sea, I discovered a big rocky mound on the shore, and I thought it was so unusual I felt I had to go explore and find out what was going on up here, and found some interesting ruins of some kind of a building project, and I'm not sure if it was ever actually built, if it collapsed, if it was just another one of those resorts that failed after the salt overwhelmed the fresh water that was coming into the lake. I'm sure I could probably find out with some research, but just a very unusual outcropping of rock in the middle of this desert sea. I found just the formation here unusual, but then I stumbled across the ruins of some foundation, and at the bottom of one of these pits I found all kinds of bird bones. I guess they flew in, but they couldn't fly out. Not a lot of birds that are good at vertical takeoff, so maybe that was their demise. Or maybe they were sitting up on top of the rim here and fell in and couldn't fly out. After exploring the Salton Sea, I moved towards Chocolate Mountain and the firing range, and discovered some interesting artifacts laying on the ground. My instinct was to go pick it up and turn it over, but I heeded the sign and did not get myself blown up. After a day of exploring, I decided to go out and introduce myself to the range, one of the social infrastructures of Slab City. It's basically a bar slash stage for entertainment and socializing. Lots of ratty couches and chairs, but it still had an interesting vibe. If you could ignore the meth heads and the riffraff, there were lots of other interesting people out here. A good mix of normal and abnormal street people and, regular people, I guess, is probably the best way of describing it. And I don't want to sound like a snob, because I try not to judge, but it's not a lot of people hang out with the homeless, and that's kind of what that's a lot of the vibe of Slab City, is people on the bottom, and whether they choose to be there or not, I don't know, but I'm sure there's probably a lot of choices being made out here, and that's probably one of the most interesting things about the whole culture of the place is there's a mix where you don't really see that in normal society. You don't see a mix of bottom and top, but you do out here. You see all ranges of socioeconomic, bottom, middle, top. Well, maybe not so much top, but there's lots of people with money out here, mixing with people that don't have $10, and people that maybe want to change their status, and people that are there because they want to be. And this is a little bit of a tour of East Jesus, the big art installation / encampment. Apparently this is where the artists live, and they also seem a little bit touchy about their camp. I saw lots of fences and lots of signs out here to the effect of, hey, we live here. You're not welcome in our house, so kind of stick to the installation. But the installation was free. You could move freely through here. They just had barriers. I'm sure that nobody wants people walking through their living room, and sometimes it's kind of hard to tell where the art ends and the living space begins, so that's probably why the signs were up. But I did talk to one fellow out here that gave me a brief tour and asked if I wanted an extensive one, but I was assuming that he probably wanted to get $10 for the tour, so I just I politely refused and kept walking through. But it's lots of interesting folk art is what I would call it, and maybe a little bit more legitimate art also mixed in here. It's kind of hard to tell what's what. You had to step back a lot of times just to see what was going on. This kind of looked like a vehicle, kind of looked like a contraption, kind of looked like something else. But there was lots of interesting things to see. Most of it was made out of scrap. Quite a few art cars out here, probably a lot better than the other ones. And this is probably maybe closer to a legitimate art installation, still made with junk, but still I found it quite interesting. And if you don't have a budget, what do you make your art out of? Junk is what I would say. One of the most interesting exhibits right here. Not sure what they were trying to say. Maybe working yourself to death. Join me next time as we camp out just south of Joshua Tree and get shot at.
I'm downrange.